The topic of the speech today is containment and radical Islam. Foreign policy is uniquely an arena where we should base decisions on the landscape of the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. I see the world as it is. I'm a realist, not a neoconservative, nor an isolationist.
Welcome back to AMTV News. I'm your anchor, Topher Morrison. It's Thursday, February 8th, 2013. Rand Paul, a true conservative foreign policy. What does that mean? Rand Paul has had his share of bad press after backing he whose name shall not be spoken, but his recent speech at the Heritage Foundation, yes, the Fortune 500 funded think tank that brought you Clarion Pictures and its magnum opus Iranium, a movie about Iran which conveniently omits the U.S.'s role in shaping its current radical demeanor. Really another video entirely. Anyway, Senator Rand Paul gives us a glimpse into his foreign policy philosophy and what he will likely run on in 2016, essentially coding bitter libertarian reason with sweet, sweet neoconservative honey. The full video is linked at amtvmedia.com. First, he highlights John McCain's bizarre statements in 2007 when he suggested a possible 100-year occupation in Iraq. Or was it more? I can't remember.
How long do we have to stay there? My point was, and continues to be, how long do we have to stay in Bosnia? How long do we have to stay in South Korea? How long are we going to stay in Japan? How long are we going to stay in Germany? All of those 50, 60-year periods. No one complains. No one complains. No one complains. In fact, they contribute enormously, their presence, to stability in the world. The point is, it's American casualties. We got to get Americans off the front line, have the Iraqis, as part of the strategy, take over more and more of the responsibilities. And then I don't think Americans are concerned if we're there for 100 years or 1,000 years or 10,000 years.
For 100 years or 1,000 years or 10,000 years.
This exposes the fact that McCain knows about as much about the American people and foreign policy as he does about what his daughter, Megers McCain, was doing last night.
I blanched, and I wondered what the unintended consequences of prolonged occupation would be. But McCain's call for a 100-year occupation does capture some truth, that the West is in for a long, irregular confrontation not with terrorism, which is simply a tactic, but with radical Islam. As many are quick to note, the war is not with Islam. The problem is that a radical element of Islam, the problem is that this radical Islam is no small minority, but a vibrant, often mainstream, vocal and numerous minority. In Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and even Afghanistan, where we presided over a constitution written by moderates, radical concepts such as the death penalty for blasphemy or apostasy are the law of the land.
Rand Paul calls radical Islam a mainstream ideology and correctly points to Saudi Arabia as a prime example. To me, it obliquely states our ostensible and monarchical ally who named an entire country after themselves not only foments radicalism on an astonishing scale, but is also the most militarized nation on the planet, spending 8.7% of its GDP on defense alone, double that of the United States.
Now, some libertarians argue that Western occupation and intervention fans the flames of radical Islam. I agree. But I don't agree that absent Western occupation, that radical Islam goes quietly into that good night.
And all this says to me is that while the neoconservatives salivate over a new American century, protecting Israel and slaying that mystical dragon of extremism for her, most of the world understands the world doesn't run on American power alone, and irrational zealotry is a disease better cured internally rather than through overt action. Senator Paul broke a little news as well.
Over 50% of Americans still believe Iraq attacked us on 9/11.
Tell me more. Okay, so I couldn't quite figure out where he pulled that statistic. Perhaps the same source which offered evidence of WMDs in Iraq, which could be a now defunct office within the CIA, or 63% of Republican respondents who responded to last year's Dartmouth poll who believed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction when the U.S. invaded in 2003. Half of them were at Heritage listening to Paul's speech. Rand Paul also highlights the fact from current and former Shin Bet Mossad chiefs like Meir Dagan and Israeli Army Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Benny Gantz believe three things. One, that attacks on Iran would hasten a development of a nuclear weapon, that the Iranian threat is not as imminent as many portray, and shockingly that
when foreign policy has become so monolithic, so lacking in debate, that Republicans and Democrats routinely pass foreign policy statements without debate and without votes. Where are the calls for moderation, the calls for restraint? Anyone who questions the bipartisan consensus is immediately castigated, rebuked, and their patriotism challenged. One of the most pressing questions of the day, the possibility of Iran developing nuclear weapons, appears to have less debate in this country than it receives in Israel.
having to consume even a morsel of this type of forbidden knowledge had half of the room at Heritage Foundation either performing harakiri or pouring boiling oil over themselves. For pictures of that, see the links below. Rand rejects Truman-like policy of attacking when and wherever radical Islam presents itself, providing blank checks to military and economic aid in and everywhere around the world. Funding and training are, after all, like spoken words. Once they're out there, you can't take them back.
Likewise, today's Truman's Caucus wants boots on the ground, weapons in the hands of freedom fighters everywhere, including the Syrian rebels. Perhaps we might want to ask the opinion of the 1 million Christians who live in Syria, many of whom fled Iraq after our Shiite allies were installed. Perhaps we might want to ask, will the Syrian rebels respect the rights of Christians, women, and other ethnic minorities? In the 1980s, the War Caucus in Congress armed Osama bin Laden and the Mujahideen in their fight against the Soviet Union. In fact, it was the official position of our State Department to support radical jihad against the Soviets. We all know how well that worked out.
Senator Rand Paul advocates for a kind of robust restraint Reagan often espoused, what Rand called strategic ambiguity based on respect for the Constitution and fiscal discipline. Now, Reagan obviously made his mistakes, but considering Leon Panetta has delayed a carrier group from going to the Persian Gulf because of budget woes, it sounds like our ability to strike anywhere at any time or in multiple theaters is facing a fiscal cliff of its own. We saber-rattled for much of 2012. Now we can't even get out of port? How does that even make sense? Most importantly, Rand Paul lambastes Congress for giving up its constitutional responsibility for war making.
As Keene points out, Reagan's policy was much less interventionist than the presidents of both parties who came before and after him. I would argue that a more restrained foreign policy is the true conservative foreign policy, as it includes two basic tenets of true conservatism: respect for the Constitution and fiscal discipline. I'm convinced that what we need is a foreign policy that works within these two constraints, a foreign policy that works within the confines of the Constitution and the realities of our fiscal crisis. Today in Congress, there is no such nuance, no such moderation of dollars or of executive power. Last year, I introduced a non-binding resolution in the Senate, reiterating the president's words when he ran for office, that no president should go to war unilaterally without the approval of Congress, unless an imminent threat to our national security exists. Not one Democrat voted to support candidate Obama's words, and only 10 Republicans did.
I always found it funny how the past few years, how the anti-war movement evaporated so quickly since our peace president was elected. And here I'll finish with some Rand Paul highlights of what he thinks a conservative, or better put, constitutional foreign policy looks like.
What the United States needs is a foreign policy that finds that middle path, a policy that is not rash or reckless, a foreign policy that is reluctant, restrained by constitutional checks and balances, but does not appease, a foreign policy that recognizes the danger of radical Islam, but also the inherent weakness of radical Islam. A foreign policy that recognizes the danger of bombing countries on the pretext of what they might someday do. A foreign policy that requires, as Kennan put it, a long-term patient but firm and vigilant containment of expansive tendencies. A policy that understands the distinction between vital and peripheral interests. No one believes that Kennan was an isolationist. But Kennan did advise that non-interference in the internal affairs of another country was, after all, a long-standing principle of American diplomacy that should be accepted only when there is a sufficiently powerful national interest and when we have the means to conduct such intervention successfully and can afford the cost. Madison wrote that the Constitution supposes what history demonstrates, that the executive branch is most prone to go to war and most interested in it, and therefore the Constitution has, with studied care, vested that power in the legislature. We've forgotten this. Since the Korean War, Congress has ignored its responsibility to restrain the president. Congress has abdicated its role in declaring war. What a foreign policy would look like that tries to strike a balance, first it would have less soldiers stationed overseas and less bases. Instead of large, limitless land wars in multiple theaters, we would, when necessary, target our enemy and strike with lethal force. We would not presume that we build nations, nor would we presume that we have the resources to build nations. Many of the countries formed after World War I are collections of tribal regions that have never been governed by a central government and may in fact be ungovernable. When we must intervene with force, we should attempt to intervene in cooperation with the host government. Intervention against the will of the host government is war, such as Afghanistan or Libya, and it should require a declaration of war by Congress. Such constitutional obstacles purposely make it more difficult to go to war. This was the founders' intention, to make war less likely. We did not declare war or authorize force to begin the war in Libya. This is a dangerous precedent. In our foreign policy, Congress has become not even a rubber stamp, but an irrelevancy. With Libya, the president sought permission from the UN, from NATO, from the Arab League, from everyone but the U.S. Congress. It's an insult. And how did Congress react? Congress just simply let him get away with it. The looming debt crisis will force us to reassess our role in the world. Admiral Mullen calls the debt the greatest threat to our national security. Former Defense Secretary Robert Gates noted, at some point, fiscal insolvency at home translates into strategic insolvency abroad. Gates added that addressing our financial crisis will require both re-examining missions and capabilities, and perhaps most importantly, will entail going places that have been avoided by politicians in the past. It's time for all Americans, and especially conservatives, to become as critical and reflective when examining foreign policy as we are when examining domestic policy. Should our military be defending this nation or constantly building other nations? What constitutes our actual national defense? And what parts of our foreign policy are more like an irrational offense? It's the soldier's job to do his duty, but it's the citizen's job to question their government, particularly when it comes to putting soldiers in harm's way. And of course, the questions that are forced to ask today is, can we afford this?
Capturing every corner of the alternative media, watch AMTV News Monday through Friday. Follow me on Twitter at AMTV News and like us at Facebook on Greenwave TV. For more videos like these and source material, visit amtvmedia.com, the home of the AMTV network. The voice of independence.